Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Now Foods Monthly Webinar Series. My name is Susan Valakis, and I'm the Training Development Coordinator for our online education program, Now Productology. In the interest of time, we're going to handle the Q&A a little differently. If you have questions during the presentation, just click on the little chat bubble that you see on your screen, type your question, and send it, and we will respond directly to you by email within 24 hours. And finally, about an hour or so after the presentation, you'll receive an email with a link to the recorded copy of this presentation so you can use it for replay or to share it with your staff. So let's get on with the show. Today's webinar is presented by one of my favorite speakers and one of our very own at Now Foods, Neil Levin, who serves as our Senior Nutrition Education Manager. Neil is also a nationally board-certified clinical nutritionist with a diplomate in advanced nutritional laboratory assessment. He is a professional member of the International and American Associations of Clinical Nutritionists and also a member of the Scientific Council of the National Clinical Nutrition Certification Board. And he's also on the board of directors of the Mid-American Health Organization, or MAHO as you may know it. So with that said, I know that Neil has some really great information for us today, so let's get started. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you all for joining us today.
We're going to talk about minerals, particularly calcium and magnesium. Now, how many of you are familiar with the booklet we have, Mineral Nutrients? Some of this information is in that little handout. So when we talk about mineral nutrients, we're talking about dietary elements. These are elements like you would see on the periodic table, for example. And the nutrient version means that there's something that we need, some element from the earth that is essential for life. We call them minerals, but technically they're elements. They're on the chart with all the elements, things like that. And all living cells require the mineral nutrients, and there's some other elements that are not nutrients, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, all essential for life, but we get them regardless of having to take them as foods or supplements. They're kind of everywhere. There's our periodic table, and you'll notice on the left I highlighted number 12 and number 20, magnesium and calcium. Alkaline earth metals is the category. So these minerals are nutrients that are soil, water, they're in the foods. They're the main thing that plants pick up from the soil, and the plants use them to make different compounds in their own bodies. And we get them from plants and water and even from eating meats, if we eat meat. So animals get these from eating plants or other animals, typically. Some animals drink some water and get different ones, but not all the ones they need there. And there's quite different content of minerals in the soil and in the water. There's some parts of the earth, for example, that are very high in selenium. Some areas are very low. Some areas are very high in iodine or other things like fluoride, and low in other areas. So different minerals and trace elements are going to vary depending on where you are and where your food comes from. And food processing will often take the minerals as well as the vitamins away. So supplementation is a way to make sure we're getting enough of these. Let's say you're living in an area where the soil is not that healthy, it doesn't contain the right balance of all the minerals for you, and you're eating all local food. Where are you getting your iodine? Where are you getting your other mineral elements that you need for life? If you're not supplementing, you're risking being deficient. You're chancing having gaps in your nutritional competence. So we need minerals for structures in our body, skeleton and teeth, for example, but also tissues, fluids. body enzymes are typically made up of or dependent on minerals for functioning. So almost everything in our body needs minerals in one way or another, either as a cofactor or as an actual component. So when we are buying minerals as a supplement, we're not buying pure minerals. You're not buying pure calcium. You're not buying pure magnesium. You're buying compounds with other things attached to them. And that's the way they occur in nature as well. So we have what are called chelated or pre-acidified forms. Chelate is the Greek word for qua, so it implies a bonding, an attachment. So if you have a pre-acidified form, it's less alkaline and more dilute than other crude forms, like carbonates. Calcium carbonate, for example, is a strong antacid. And if you buy Tums or something like that, if you buy some of our products that are designed to be neutralizing excess acid, calcium carbonate is going to be a main component there. When you get these pre-acidified chelated forms, however, they tend to be, in general, more bioavailable, not always, but generally. They're also considered pre-digested because they're pre-acidified, and they have increased solubility, which is an advantage for anyone who has poor stomach acid, including those who are taking antacids, who might have difficulty absorbing calcium and other nutrients from their diet because they're not taking it out of the foods. Stomach acid actually helps you tear apart foods, and it makes you have access to vitamins as well as minerals. For example, your B12 status partially depends on your stomach acid and being able to remove it from the food matrix. So that the digestive capability and separating the nutrients from the food matrix so that they're bioavailable is part of the competence of having good stomach acid. If you don't have good stomach acid, you're not going to remove and make available for your body these elements, these minerals, and you're not going to be able to compound them to these acids, these weak acids that are typically used in supplementation to make these minerals bioavailable. So another advantage, since they're pre-acidified and pre-digested, you can take them between meals. A lot of times if you're taking, for example, calcium carbonate, it's okay if you're taking it with meals. It absorbs fine if you have good stomach acid, not so well if you don't have good stomach acid, but you tend to do better taking it with a meal, although it will reduce some of the acid in your stomach available for digestion and for activating enzymes that help digestion. For example, the pepsin enzyme is activated in an acidic environment. So it needs a certain acidity before it's going to work as a proteolytic enzyme digesting protein. So the first step of protein digestion is activating pepsin using hydrochloric acid in the stomach. So some of the elemental forms are the carbonates. You can get calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate bonded to carbonic acid. It's a form of carbon. This is the form you will typically find in rock powders and shells. This will be in dolomite powder, for example, or limestone. It will be in oyster shell. It will be in coral calcium. And this is a long-time historical source of dietary minerals. I've been in the health food business starting as a retailer in 1973, and most of the minerals we were selling in those days were things like dolomite and oyster shell. So there weren't a lot of these chelates available in those days. So these are still alkaline forms, non-acidified, not pre-digested. They will absorb pretty well if you have good stomach acid, but if you don't, not so well. And they can actually form chelates in the stomach with food acids. So the things that we bond these minerals to in supplements, for example, the other types of acids that are attached to them are also in foods. So, for example, citric acid, it's in foods. Malic acid is in foods. Amino acids are in foods. Vitamin C, ascorbic acid, is in foods. So you can actually make these compounds during digestion if you take it with a meal. And the meal has these, what are called low molecular weight weak acids that are used for chelation. So the citrate is a very popular form. And it's a mineral like calcium or magnesium bonded to citric acid. It's not alkaline anymore. It's pre-acidified. And so it's pre-digested. You can take it with or without meals. It does not require stomach acid. It's already digested and acidified. Or the malate, the calcium malate or magnesium malate, which is actually more common, though you will find some brands will sell calcium citrate malate combination, and there's actually been some studies on that, and some physicians and practitioners will recommend that form, the citrate malate form. Not one that we have, but we do sell combinations in some cases. So it's a popular source. Just like the citrate, it's a non-alkaline, pre-acidified, pre-digested form, does not require stomach acid, and can be taken with or between meals. Gluconate's another one. This is kind of an old-fashioned one. You don't see it too commonly except for potassium gluconate in some cases. There's not a lot of magnesium gluconate or calcium gluconate out there anymore. So it was something that was sold 20, 30 years ago, a little more commonly. Again, it's pre-acidified and non-alkaline, can be taken with or without meals. It's bonded to gluconic acid. And the glycinate. These are minerals bonded to the very simple amino acid glycine. You notice glycine does not have an L or a D or a DL. It's too simple of a molecule in structure to have optical rotation and have these mirror image forms. It only has one form. So this is a common source, and you see magnesium glycinate. We have several supplements with that. Trace elements like the Albion tracks, which is their abbreviation for the real amino acid chelate system. And a lot of our trace minerals are the Albion tracks that are the often the glycinate form, not exclusively, but often. The iron bisglycinate, for example, would be one form. Bis just refers to a multiplicity where there's more than one glycine attached. And again, it's non-alkaline, pre-acidified, doesn't need stomach acid, can be taken with or between meals. And other forms you'll see sometimes in supplements are the aspartates, lactates, oxides, chlorides, ascorbates, and picolinates. And forms do affect the mineral's absorption, how it's made bioavailable, how efficient it is at absorption, what it does, what are the target sites for both absorption and what it does in the body. But you notice here it says it's also what it's attached to, what the mineral itself is attached to as a carrier is a functional method that delivers an additional nutrient. So if you have magnesium to taurine and you have magnesium taurinate, they're both important for the heart and nervous system, so you now have a cardiovascular form of magnesium that also has the amino acid taurine. I actually take both of these separately, but interesting for my heart. But there's other forms like the lactates that's made with lactic acid, and that's the form, for example, of calcium in milk, calcium lactate. It's not that popular because it doesn't have that much calcium. The elemental percentage of calcium in calcium lactate is very low. I actually have a chart coming up. I'll show you some of those. The oxide forms are not super popular. There's a lot of chatter in the internet saying that the oxides are no good. There's actually good for some people. Again, if you have good stomach acid, if you're taking them with a meal, they're fine, taking the oxides or carbonates. The chlorides are a form you'll often find in drink mixes and things like that because they're water soluble. They do tend to absorb fairly well. Chloride is a little controversial because it's believed to be sometimes even more responsible for effects on blood pressure and things like that than sodium. So when you see sodium on the label, it might be an indicator of sodium chloride, of added salt, and some of the problems with excess salt in the diet might be from excess chlorine and not necessarily just the sodium. Or picolinate. Zinc picolinate is the form of zinc in mother's milk, for example. So looking at calcium specifically, we use it for skeletal and dental structures. It's used for bones and hard tissues. But it's also used for clotting, for endocrine system, for making hormones, for signaling. We don't produce calcium. We have to get it from the diet. It's an essential nutrient. And all through our lives, our bones and teeth have calcium deposited on them and absorbed. It's interesting. I had some dental work done, and the person doing the work said that teeth are basically, they're alive, but you don't need the roots after they grow. That if you got a root canal, for example, the tooth doesn't die. It still pulls in nutrients. It still has a life. It still can be losing calcium or absorbing calcium. The root is mostly needed during the growth phase. And that's why after a root canal, your teeth can still be intact, except for the center, of course. So during childhood and adolescence, of course, as the teeth are growing, the absorption is greater. When you're a young adult, they're even. Late in life, we tend to lose calcium from the bone, and having optimum calcium intake helps offset the imbalance. So there are some permitted health claims for calcium. These are from the FDA webpage. And first of all, National Institutes of Health says that people need, by the time they're an adult, about 1,000 milligram a day. These are the RDAs. RDAs are a little different from the daily values that are on product labels, both foods and supplements, because the FDA actually comes up with a different number. For example, you'll see a daily value of 1,000 on a calcium label, for example. And so they're kind of generalizing. It's not the amount everybody needs as an RDA, but it's the amount that's a standard for labeling. So there's a difference between daily value and RDAs. Sometimes they're the same. Sometimes there's a variation. Sometimes they take an average or a low one. The National Institutes of Health sets up the RDAs, and the FDA sets up the daily values based on RDAs and RDIs. So one claim that they do allow, and we don't necessarily use these claims, but just so you're aware they do exist, these are something that the FDA has judged meets a scientific agreement and is an authorized health claim. Remember, most dietary supplements do not have approved health claims. If you make a structure function claim, you cannot talk about improving health, preventing disease, or anything like that. You have to talk about maintaining already healthy body structures and functions. That's where the term structure function claim comes from. So in this claim, it's calcium and osteoporosis, and labeling with calcium, osteoporosis, and calcium, vitamin D, and osteoporosis. So there's a couple different claims there. And the first one is This is a model claim that can be used in labeling to describe the relationship between calcium and osteoporosis. Adequate calcium throughout life as part of a well-balanced diet may reduce the risk of osteoporosis, or along with physical activity may reduce the risk of osteoporosis in later life. So these are a couple of examples of what are allowed, of models of approved health claims for calcium. We could use them if we wanted to. Now, there's also another category called qualified health claims, and the FDA is exercising enforcement discretion. In other words, they are not going to take action against you if you use this claim. It's not an approved claim, but it's an allowed claim. So there's a difference. And there's always a disclaimer on here, a couple disclaimers. Some evidence suggests that calcium can reduce the risk of hypertension, but FDA has determined that the evidence is inconsistent and not conclusive. So you can make a claim if you put enough disclaimers in there, in other words. Now, this is another one that is an authorized health claim that does meet the scientific agreement standard, that there's significant scientific agreement. And it's talking about calcium and vitamin D against osteoporosis. So it's the same type of language we saw before, but they added vitamin D to the calcium as part of the claim. So when we're looking at the forms and the products, this is a little chart I made with some help from my friend Tammy Mish, who worked with me on this. And the top section are the ones that we will see in now products. And the ones on the bottom, not so much, though several of these we did use to sell. So when we're looking at, for example, calcium ascorbate, you're looking at a 9 to 10% elemental calcium. So if you're taking 1,000 milligrams of calcium ascorbate, you're going to have somewhere between 90 and 100 milligrams of elemental calcium. Calcium carbonate runs about 40%. So if you're taking 1,000 milligrams of calcium carbonate, you're getting about 400 milligrams of elemental calcium. The citrate runs about 21%, and you really shouldn't see more than that in there because that's the theoretical limit. If you're seeing more, it implies there's an incomplete reaction. When we're talking about mineral chelates, we're also talking about fully reacted mineral chelates, which means that you're not just blending magnesium oxide or magnesium carbonate with citric acid and calling it magnesium citrate. And some companies actually do that, and they sell these drink mixes that will react in a liquid when you mix it in water. And nobody knows how well it reacts, what percentage is fully reacted, and how much is just the original minerals. But it's a pretty dramatic reaction. People like those kind of drinks, and they tend to work. So then we have other ones like calcium lactate pentahydrate, which is calcium lactate, which is bonded to lactic acid. It's about 13-14% elemental. So you have to take a lot more pills than, say, a calcium carbonate to get 1,000 milligrams of calcium if you're going for that level. Or coral calcium. The Aquamin is interesting. I actually have a few slides on Aquamin we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. But one thing I have on some of these are absorption rates on the right. And you'll notice calcium carbonate has a 26% absorption rate, and calcium citrate has a 22%. So calcium carbonate in general actually absorbs better than calcium citrate. However, look at the number next to there, the range. The range is actually much wider on a calcium carbonate because if you have poor stomach acid, you're not going to digest it well and absorb it well. And if you have good stomach acid, you might absorb it really, really well, especially if you take it with a meal. So the other thing is, notice the comment on the right, calcium carbonate is insoluble at a neutral pH, where calcium citrate is soluble. So there's some details like that. It's a little misleading to overgeneralize, and everyone thinks calcium citrate is better than carbonate. Not necessarily for everybody. It absorbs better than calcium carbonate. Not necessarily for everybody. That's an overgeneralization. If you have poor stomach acid, probably. And I have some other calcium sources I put down underneath the bold line there. Milk, for example, is 33% calcium, which of course would be mostly calcium lactate. And some other forms you'll find, the bone meal, dolomite, oyster shell, just to give you a sense. And on some of them that are from rock powders or shells, you will have, of course, heavy metal issues because of the sourcing. So this is kind of an interesting chart that we made the other day. So here's a few of the calcium selection we have. Obviously, we have a lot more than that, but just to give you a sense of the variety. So calcium carbonate should be taken with food or immediately after eating. It's absorbed more effectively with food. The pre-acidified forms are well absorbed at any time. Be sure and get plenty of water. It's a water-soluble nutrient. And you really should limit to about 500 milligrams of calcium at one time. If you want to take 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day, it's better to do it in divided doses because you probably won't absorb it all at once. And these are a couple of different kinds of calcium carbonate, the coral calcium and the calcium carbonate. Coral calcium does contain calcium carbonate, but for a long time its claim to fame was that it was the most alkaline, highest pH form of calcium. So it was used kind of as a cheat. If you were testing, say, your urine pH and it wasn't up to the neutral range and you wanted to raise it, the normal thing you would do is eat more alkaline forming foods. And I'm going to be talking about that in a couple minutes and giving you some examples. But green foods would be a good example. People eat a lot of the green foods to alkalinize the body is one of the claims you'll see on those kind of things. And coral calcium is kind of a cheat to try to raise the pH in the bloodstream quickly. And it's something practitioners have used for many years, more so than just for a calcium source. So it's a very alkaline source, and it's not just alkaline because of the calcium carbonate. There's some other elemental forms in there that are even more alkaline that shift it even higher on the pH range. So when you bond these, you will, of course, get these forms we talked about before, the calcium citrate, malate, amino acid chelate, gluconate, or ascorbate are some of the forms. The amino acid chelate could be specific amino acids like calcium glycinate or calcium bonded to a specific amino acid. It's always possible to bond one amino acid or a complex. Some of them will use barley or soy protein or different protein sources. So if it's an amino acid chelate and it doesn't state a specific amino acid, it's going to be a food that's high in protein that it's bonded to, trying to get the protein out of that food. For example, soy or barley would be a couple that you'll see on different brands' product labels. And then you have some of the ones that are these pre-acidified, pre-digested chelated forms. And here's some examples. Now, I did promise to talk about the Aquamin red mineral algae. And so this is something that is harvested from the coast of Iceland and processed in Ireland. It is a rich source of calcium, magnesium, and trace minerals. And you're getting a boost, you're getting a more effective form of calcium with some magnesium and with some trace minerals. So it's not just calcium. And you'll notice we're looking at roughly 32% on that chart of elemental calcium compared to straight up calcium carbonate being around 40%. So it's lower, but the difference is largely the magnesium content and the trace mineral content, which are positives. Now, what makes this different from other forms of calcium carbonate is the structure. And if you look at it under an electron microscope, you will see there's almost a honeycomb type shape in the red mineral algae, the Aquamin trademark material that we use. And it gives it benefits in terms of absorption and function by having a different structure than a rock powder or a shell powder. And it has the trace minerals and magnesium in there that, again, give it a broader effect. This is actually one that I formulate with fairly often. You might notice that Aquamin is the preferred calcium source in many of our multivitamins. And the reason is more than one benefit for it. For example, if we're over 30% elemental calcium instead of 21%, for example, for calcium citrate, we can now make a smaller pill. We have a plant-sourced calcium, not a rock-sourced calcium, with a different structure. So we have the benefit of claiming it's a food source, a plant source, saying that it's got better bioavailability than some of the other forms that are higher in elemental calcium. And it also tends to be lower in heavy metals, allowing us to escape having to have special labeling in California. If some of the heavy metals are a little higher, then we could get away with not labeling there because they have a unique law there in terms of labeling certain things. So this is also something we've used in a couple of our joint formulas as a base, because if you're using, say, 40 milligrams or some low amount of an active to give a small pill, and you have to fill that capsule with something else, we can't just give you a tiny capsule that's half empty or 3/4 empty. We have to use a filler. This is a synergistic filler that we will often use in formulas like that. So we want to preserve our bone structure and bone strength, even on a Western diet. We want to maintain our bone density. We want to aid mineralization and maturization of the bone cells. And Aquamin with vitamin D do support healthy bone mineralization. And there's a web page there if you want to read some of the studies on there. And the reason we use this in a couple of our joint formulas, like the UC2, for example, is that it tended to have a good effect on walking distance in people who took it. These are older people who took it, and they were able to walk better than taking glucosamine or some other things. So it does tend to have a positive effect on mobility and walking distance in people that might struggle with that as they age. So we do have the red algae calcium powder, which is just the Aquamin material with no other ingredients. Very clean. We've got the red mineral algae vegetarian calcium, which is a vegetarian formula with vitamin D. This is actually the one that I give to my wife and our foster daughter. We take this. So this is because of the good source of calcium and vitamin D. We take separate magnesium. Don't worry about that. And that leads us into magnesium. I don't have as many slides on magnesium because we've kind of talked about the issues with the chelation and the different forms, but magnesium is also abundant in the human body. It's another mineral involved in skeletal and dental health. And this is a phrase you'll often see. Magnesium is essential for over 300 biochemical processes in the body. Last number I saw was around 360, so it's well above 300, including cardiovascular, immune, muscle, lipids, enzymes, and energy production. I'll give you an example that a lot of people don't know. If you want to take flax oil or chia seeds or walnut oil to get the omega-3, ALA, fatty acid in there, in order to convert that into EPA or DHA, you need a magnesium-dependent enzyme called delta-6 desaturase. So that is an enzyme that only works if it has enough magnesium. You will not do the conversion if you just take flax oil all day long and don't have enough magnesium. That's just one example of what magnesium does. Neurological is another issue. We, of course, have the Magtine product. And higher magnesium intake from diet and supplements combined is associated with a significantly lower risk of developing metabolic syndrome in healthy women. Metabolic syndrome, of course, is a cluster of symptoms that is a risk factor for potentially developing diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver. This is not a disease. These are symptoms that seem to increase the risks of eventually developing the disease. So minimizing these symptoms associated with metabolic syndrome is considered maintaining health. So these are some of the magnesium products we have. The glycinate or bisglycinate, magnesium transporters, magnesium malate, and the magnesium forms. This is a chart I made similarly to the calcium chart you saw before. And you'll see that on some of these, the typical elemental amount of mineral is only 7%, 9% in some of these. The highest would be 22%, or the oxide, 60%. That is why a lot of times you see magnesium oxide. You can put 400 milligrams of elemental magnesium in a single capsule. You cannot do that with these other forms. They're too dilute. You have to use too much of them. So, but you'll notice, look at the absorption rate on magnesium oxide, 23% versus 24% for magnesium glycinate, which is often called bisglycinate, more accurate term. But again, the magnesium oxide is insoluble in water and is only about half soluble in hydrochloric acid and good stomach acid. So it's got a lot more magnesium in there per gram or per serving, but it has to be solubilized by taking it with a meal and having the stomach acid and the other components, the acids and things you need to make your own chelates in the body. So it is kind of interesting to me to look at the comparison. Again, we often hear magnesium oxide is crap, it doesn't absorb well. There's some people saying it's only 5% absorption. Well, if you're taking it with water between meals and you don't have good stomach acid, probably. But it depends on the person. We are all biochemically different. We have different stomach acid, we eat different foods, we have different digestive capabilities. But when we're looking in general at the absorption rate, the glycinate or bisglycinate and the oxide are virtually identical, except the bisglycinate, these chelated forms you could take between meals or with meals. You have to take the non-acidified, non-predigested forms with meals if you expect to get significant absorption, but you can get significant absorption. Magnesium transporters was an idea I had a year or two ago that was, let's combine a bunch of our magnesiums, because back in the 1980s when I was a retailer, back in the olden days, we used to have formulas like this that would combine different ones. And what's the reason for that? Because they absorb differently, and because the carrier, the citric acid, the taurine, the malic acid, the glycine, the aspartic acid, do different things in the body, so they tend to transport magnesium to different areas, different tissues, and have different functions. So the magnesium malate, for example, is something people often use as a way to relax tight muscles after exercise, for example. The taurinate, as I mentioned earlier, would be a heart nutrient. So there's different forms that tend to do different things. Aspartate, aspartic acid is associated with energy and energetics and brain function, nerve function, things like that. So you're getting a wider range of effects from magnesium, but you're still getting a significant amount of magnesium in one capsule. I actually take this formula twice a day, and I take the Magtine, which is the brain magnesium, as a third capsule at night, just to give you an idea of, I actually believe in this stuff. And by the way, there's not insignificant amounts. These are not just label dressing where it's 1% or 2%. These are all significant amounts of these forms. These are not just tiny, tiny, tiny amounts that are on there for nothing, just to look good. Or we have the CalMag caps with trace minerals and vitamin D. And you'll see this is a mixture of the carbonate, citrate, malate forms of calcium and magnesium. On this one, we actually tell you how much of each. A lot of times we don't. We'll just list them in order of prominence without telling you how much of each. But this is definitely one that would be better taken with a meal. Or the calcium magnesium soft gels. This is the carbonate and citrate, or oxide and citrate. It's predominantly going to be the carbonate and oxides. So again, if you have good stomach acid and you take it with a meal, you should be fine. The higher percentage of elemental minerals can offset the sometimes lower absorption rates, assuming that you're taking it with a meal and have decent stomach acid. Or the CalMag DK, which is a pretty popular product. Again, it's vitamin D3 and K2 in there, so it does help with absorption. D3 helps with absorbing calcium. K2 helps with moving it into cells and tissues, such as bone tissue. So absorbing it is not enough. You have to actually get it to do what you want after it's in the body. So on that note, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about vitamins D and K that I just mentioned, because they have a role in how these minerals work as well. Vitamin D is found primarily in animal foods, in fungi like mushrooms, and in sunlight. So this is something that you can't always make. So it's unique because you can synthesize this directly from sunlight. And the process is in the skin, ultraviolet B rays shine on cholesterol, on animal sterols in this case, which is cholesterol, and make pre-vitamin D, which converts to vitamin D3, which is transported to the liver. It goes through liver and kidney transformation to make active hormones in the body that control things like bone mineralization. Now, making it from the skin sounds good, but it's not always possible. The higher latitude you are, the farther north or south on the planet, away from the equator, the more sunlight it takes. Darker skin pigmentation blocks the rays getting through the skin. winter. In Chicago, where we are here, between late September and late March, we cannot make vitamin D. The sun is too weak and is at too shallow of an angle through the atmosphere. Meteorologist Tom Skilling was on TV last night, and he said that this time of year, the intensity of sunlight is about 3.5 times what it is in December. 3.5 times as much sun intensity right now because the angle is different. Avoidance of the sun is another issue. Clothes, sunblocks, cultural reasons, or you don't want to go out in the heat, or all these other issues. Scar tissue can't make vitamin D. So when can we make vitamin D? This is an interesting chart. I like this chart. This shows where you are on the planet and what months you can make, theoretically, vitamin D. And if you look at it, the dark reddish maroon color that's toward the center, 10 minutes if you're light-skinned of sunlight and 45 minutes if you're dark-skinned. And that's assuming that about 25% of your skin is exposed to the sun without sunblock. So between 10 and 45 minutes if the sunlight is intense. If it's cloudy, not so much. With the orange area, that's moderate sunshine, and it takes about twice as long to get enough sunlight to make vitamin D. And this is enough to make like the RDA of vitamin D, not necessarily an optimal level. And then the yellow is low sunlight. It takes about 3 times as long, about 30 minutes for light skin, 90 minutes for dark skinned. And if you look at some areas, there's not enough sunlight for adequate amounts. You can go out at high noon on Christmas Day in most of North America, for example, and lie out in the sun stark naked and not make any vitamin D because the sunlight is not intense enough. Now, look at the right there, the shadow rule. This is very important. If your shadow is longer than your height, you cannot make vitamin D. So if you're 6 feet tall and your shadow is 7 feet long, you can't make vitamin D. Or, put in your height. If you're 5.5 feet and your shadow is 6 feet long, you cannot make vitamin D. Doesn't matter what time of day. The sun is too steep of an angle. It's filtered through too much atmosphere. And if you look at a globe, you have to imagine that a certain column of sun is now spread across a larger area of the planet than if it's directly toward the equator. That column, if you think of a sun ray as like a column, it spreads out more as it reaches an angle of the planet than more directly facing. Try it with a flashlight and a globe. You'll see what I'm talking about. That's an interesting rule. That's how you can gauge if you can make vitamin D. Do you have a shadow, a distinct shadow, because it has to be not cloudy or hazy, and is it the right length compared to your height? So there are not that many foods that naturally contain vitamin D. Oily fish, it's from the liver really. Some oils from fish like cod liver oil, but regular fish oil, EPA, DHA, does not have vitamin D because it's from the liver. Wild-caught salmon has a lot more than farm-raised salmon as well. And vitamin D has other benefits beyond bone and dental health. It does help with bone mineralization, but also the health of cells and immune function. In fact, the immune system works a lot better. It's a more effective fighting force for your immune cells in the presence of adequate vitamin D than if you have inadequate vitamin D. So in general, the RDA is just being increased from 400 to 600 IU. The RDA went up in 2010 from 400 to 600 units. The daily value is just being raised now, 10 years later, because the FDA did not raise it immediately. But even 600 is considered inadequate. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition recommended a minimum of 800 to 1,000 IU daily. Supplementation of at least 800 units is required in dark-skinned or veiled or institutionalized people, elderly people in nursing homes. If there's fat malabsorption or obesity or other things that affect vitamin D, more might be needed. And vitamin K. Vitamin K you need for bones and teeth and cardiovascular health. And it can help maintain bone mineral density. Vitamins D and K work synergistically on bone density. As I mentioned earlier, vitamin D helps you absorb nutrients, and vitamin D specifically, and vitamin K helps you move it from the bloodstream into the cells and tissues like bone tissue. So 80 micrograms a day is the RDA. About 90% of what we get from the diet is vitamin K1. About 10% is vitamin K2. The main active form of vitamin K2 is MK4. That is the general generic form of vitamin K you will find in supplements. Vitamin K2 is typically found in fermented foods. You'll find that in cheeses. You'll find that in aged meats that contain vitamin K or other ingredients, fermented foods typically. MK7 is another form of vitamin K2, normally extracted from a fermented soy food called natto, or more recently from chickpeas or garbanzo beans as an alternate for people who don't want to eat soy. So how does MK7 work? It works by increasing our levels of MK4 slowly. It's a protective nutrient to maintain bone density. It helps with arterial health because it helps keep calcium out of the bloodstream and into the areas where you need it. Now, in terms of bioavailability, this chart indicates it. The red area under the curve is very small and very short-lived, and that's your vitamin K1. K1 tends to go to the liver and make clotting factors. The green area under the curve, which is even shorter and smaller, is your MK4, your general vitamin K2 absorption. And vitamin K2 tends to not hang around in the liver making clotting factors. It tends to circulate in the bloodstream, scavenging calcium and carrying it to where it belongs, to help drive it to the bones and other tissues. And if you look at the black line, the area under the curve for MK7 is much, much longer and much taller. That area is much greater. You absorb a lot more MK7 and it lasts a lot longer, but it tends to work by slowly converting into MK4. And the last thing that I want to talk about is folic acid and vitamin B12, which have a role in this as well. Vitamin B12 tends to increase the osteoblasts, which are the cells that are making bones, making the bone tissue. And if you have a deficiency of vitamin B12 and folic acid, it can increase a compound in the body known as homocysteine, which affects collagen and weakens the collagen in the bones to make the bones more fragile. So a vitamin deficiency can lead to an increase in this undesirable compound homocysteine that can interfere with collagen in the body. And everyone's heard about collagen. We're all All the brands are selling collagen, and collagen is very important. But in order to utilize that collagen and make strong collagen in the body, you have to have your vitamins. And I want to talk a little bit about body pH and bone matrix. I kind of alluded to it before. And the body chemistry is very sensitive to pH, which is the acid-base, the acid-alkaline relationship. And it has to be maintained within strict limits. The bloodstream wants to be approximately neutral pH, roughly 7.0, if you use a pH strip on the bloodstream. If what you eat is acidic or generates acidity, your body has to neutralize the bloodstream to keep the pH balance at the appropriate level. It's not always successful. So what is used to balance that? Typically calcium. That calcium can come right out of the bones to neutralize excess acidity in your circulating blood. So a high acid diet, and we're not talking about high acid in terms of acidic foods like citrus foods. We're talking about the effect of foods on your body chemistry, on how acid alkaline your bloodstream is, your general pH, not the actual pH of the foods. And just to explain it, here's some pictures. What are alkaline forming? Most produce, lentils, spices, and herbs, and seeds and nuts in general. What's acid forming in the body? Meat, fish, poultry, eggs, grains, legumes. So you might find, for example, a paleo diet that is skimping on the fruits and vegetables or seeds and nuts might be more acid forming than is healthy. Now this is a chart that I actually haven't posted on my blog at honestnutrition.com, but it's from the Health Studies Collegium and Dr. Russell Jaffe, MD, PhD, who is one of my trainers, one of the people who trained me to be a clinical nutritionist. He and his colleagues came up with this chart. And it shows you, if you look at each line, to the left is more alkaline and to the right is more acidic in terms of the effect on the body. So if you look at any category, look at oils. Pumpkin seed oil is more neutral. Walnut oil is more acidic. Pumpkin seed oil is the most alkaline. So there's kind of a range. Some things, if you have to choose, are more or less. If you look at citrus fruits, limes are the most alkaline, and orange is the most acidic in terms of effect on the body. And why is that? Limes are tartar. They contain more citric acid. The body actually uses things like citric acid and malic acid to stimulate alkaline compounds in the body. Eating acidic foods in some cases makes the body more alkaline. So you can't go by the superficial, oh, it contains acid, it's a citrus fruit. It's all acidic. Actually, all the citrus fruits are pretty much on the more alkaline side of the chart. So this is a very useful if you're trying to deal with people who are not healthy. If they're trying to get healthier, typically a more alkaline diet tends to be healthy. For example, for health restoration, they recommend 80% of the diet be alkaline forming foods, and for health maintenance, about 60%. So that's my last slide. I just wanted to introduce people to that concept. It's not just the minerals, it's the diet. And diet has an effect on how much of the minerals we need. We cannot assume that our foods are going to contain every mineral element we want in the amounts and ratios that we need for our own personal individual biochemistry. We have to assume that we might have to bridge some gaps by using nutrients, and multivitamins are a great way to start. Multi-minerals or CalMag formulas are another way. And don't ignore the things like vitamin D, vitamin K, vitamins B12 and folic acid that are used as part of the body's system of making bone, of maintaining bone, of using these elements, because the body is using all these things in general. They're using them together. It's taking a whole orchestra of nutrients and making a symphony of health.
So that concludes my presentation today. I do thank you for taking the time to participate in this, and we'll turn you back to Sue.
Thank you, Neil, for an excellent presentation. I'm always so appreciative to be a part of these webinars because I learn so much too. And speaking of learning, make sure you check out our Now Productology online training program for retailers. You'll find it in the retailer portal at nowfoods.com/retailers, and you will gain online knowledge for in-store sales. So be sure to check it out. Remember, you'll receive an answer by email to the questions that you submitted today. You'll also receive a link to the recording of this presentation. So thanks once again for joining us, and we'll see you next month.